So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you guys very much for coming today. Today is the inaugural session of the Stern Signature Series. My name is Stephen Levine. This is Jacqueline Bennett. And the two of us have really collaborated a great deal over the past year to think about a series that is run by the students and that is also keeping in mind the ideas that were put forth in Dean Henry's new launch orientation at the beginning of the MBA experience, which are world, city, and business. And today we are hoping to kick off the first of a larger series that will hopefully have multiple sessions a year and will include various speakers that are brought in by MBA students. So if you guys have any ideas of speakers that you'd like to bring in, please come speak with Jacqueline or myself. We would love to talk to you about it and get the ball rolling for next year as well. Without further ado, Jacqueline's going to introduce today's incredible speaker.
Thank you, Stephen. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited and honoured to introduce Jared today as our inaugural speaker for this series, which we hope will be long and engaged for all the students at Stern. So Jared Cohen is currently the Director of Google Ideas and Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a non-fiction author. Previously, he served as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff and as a close advisor to both Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton. Jared has conducted research in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and throughout Africa. Cohen is the author of Children of Jihad, 100 Days of Silence, and is currently co-authoring a book about technology and international relations with Eric Schmidt to be published by Knopf next year. He's also co-author with Eric Schmidt of The Digital Disruption, Connectivity and the Diffusion of Power, which appeared in Foreign Affairs just a few months before the Arab Spring. In 2011, Vanity Fair named Jared as a member of the Next Establishment. The Washington Post and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government named him one of 6 top American leaders, and Foreign Policy listed him as one of the top 100 global thinkers. He currently serves as a member of the National Counterterrorism Center's Directors Advisory Board. He received his BA from Stanford University and his Master of Philosophy in International Relations from Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar, and he speaks Swahili. But I think we get English today. So at this point, Jared, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you all. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you for coming out during your lunch break. Your food looks very good. These are always my favorite settings to speak in. I always find that when I speak at business schools, I end up running into some of the students that I interacted with in various capacities, and I can think of a number of instances where I've ended up working with several of them. So this is always fun, and I like to do a good scan of the audience to see who's here, because I know you're going to pop up later at some point. I'm going to anchor my discussion today around Google Ideas, but I'm going to do so by kind of taking you through the journey that was Google Ideas. Because in some respects, the sort of big idea that Google is testing is a concept that's been in the works for, I think about 8 years. And one of my least favorite questions, but it's also the most frequent question that I get asked, is why did you leave the State Department and go to Google? And the reason I hate that question is it assumes that the job title you have and the name of the company or entity that you work for is what matters. And the point that I always make is whether I work at the State Department, Google, whether I'm wandering around writing, it really does not matter that much. I've been working on the same thing for over 8 years. And all these other sort of hats that I've worn are really just platforms to continue pursuing the same objectives and the same interests and passions that I have, which are the intersection of technology and global challenges and countering violence. Those are the 2 things that I consistently care about and have consistently focused on regardless of what hat that I'm wearing. And I think it's an important message to hammer home because we too often assume that we have to take on the sort of attributes or the characteristics of the place we're working or the title that we have. And my view is you don't. You pick the cause or the passion that you care most about, and everything else is sort of a means to that end. Let me start by giving you just a high-level explanation of Google Ideas, and then I'm going to come back to that later on because I want to sort of take you through its evolution. At a high level, we describe Google Ideas as the company's think/do tank. We created it about a year and a half ago without much of a blueprint. And what it's evolved into is an entity at the company that focuses on all the challenges in the world that don't fall in an obvious philanthropic box and that don't fall in an obvious core business box. So there are challenges that kind of make you scratch your head and say, why is Google doing this? Why is the private sector doing this? I don't understand the philanthropy model. I don't understand the core business model. Well, therein sort of lies a very critical gap, which is some of the challenges that keep us awake at night more than others are the ones that private sector companies aren't actually set up to think about, that people working on these challenges don't have a point of entry into these companies to actually engage them on. And so I try to look 5 to 7 years out at the challenges that don't have an obvious nexus with technology today and try to reframe them in ways that account for technology. And Google Ideas works with other private sector entities. We work with governments. We work with NGOs. We work with academics. We work with lots of different stakeholders to collectively try to understand what these challenges look like in 5 to 7 years when 5 billion new people come online in parts of the world ridden with the greatest number of challenges. So that's the think part of the think/do tank. Then as we reframe these challenges, we want to do more than just say, here's what they're going to look like, here's how we should think about them. We'll actually go out and build things to try to prove what we're talking about. So that may be a product, that may be something technological that we build that we hand to someone else to implement. What we build is not designed to change the nature of these challenges. What we build is not designed to sort of fundamentally address the global challenge. It's designed to demonstrate a proof of concept for how technology can be used to address major global challenges. And so our focus areas is sort of the best way to understand how we channel our energy. So we work on weak and failed states. We work on governance issues. We work on radicalization and terrorism. We work on illicit networks, so drug cartels, arms smuggling, human trafficking, organ smuggling, these sorts of issues. And we're currently exploring a number of others. But all of these are sort of challenges that are quite important, and there's not really a clear stakeholder leading the charge. And we're sort of in the middle of this journey right now where people are beginning to understand why this is essential to Google as a company. So before I sort of take you back to the history, let me give you a little bit of what the current business argument is for it. So 7 or 8 years ago when Google acquired YouTube, nobody knew that one day we would wake up and all of a sudden be asked questions about Anwar al-Awlaki and Al-Qaeda and terrorism. And then all these videos started popping up online. And as a company, we were put in a situation where we had to get smart on a set of issues that we thought were issues for governments to worry about, or we thought were issues for academics and people sort of in the international relations space to focus on. And what we found was technology had basically come into contact with one of the greatest global challenges of our time, struggle against violent extremism. And so reactively, we had to get smart on this. Now, as a company, there's a lot of in-house expertise on these challenges, in particular as it pertains to online video, in particular as it pertains to the nuances of what constitutes freedom of speech and what constitutes inciting hate and violence. And so we've developed this expertise. But that was reactive. So part of my job from a business standpoint is to look at the challenges in the future that technology will obviously intersect with and make sure that how we think about these challenges is not based on 48 hours of reacting frantically, but rather a proactive, concerted effort to demonstrate and utilize our company's vast resources to engage. So the challenge of sort of narco trafficking and human trafficking and arms smuggling, we know that this is an issue that already is starting to intersect with technology. So we as a company with our convening power, our engineering resources, want to think about how we can proactively play a role in curbing and disrupting these illicit networks. So if I told you, or if you told me back in 2004 that I would ever be working for a company like Google, or that I would be standing in front of you talking about the intersection of technology and these issues, I really would have thought you were completely crazy. I'm not an engineer. I'm not technical by background. I sort of stumbled into this field by accident. And my whole sort of career, to date at least, has been sort of a series of accidentally stumbling into something that I got curious about, and then sort of adapting and changing my career path to kind of follow that. So if I take you back to 2004, I took a trip to Iran when I was in grad school. And my initial goal in traveling to Iran was to interview opposition leaders, reformers, dissidents. And about 3 or 4 days after getting there, the secret police came into my room and found a 2-page list of people that I wanted to interview. And I hadn't vetted that list very carefully, so there were dead people on it. Like some of the people had sort of multiple names. It was just a very badly sort of crafted research and a very ominous list for intelligence services that were watching me. And I had sort of lied to the Iranian embassy and said I was an archaeology student and wanted to go to Iran to sort of study the ancient ruins and so forth. And next thing they knew, I was sort of wandering around interviewing dissidents. And so it just was a bad situation all around. And I'll never forget when they took me to this building, this very tall guy, about 6'5", came in and was screaming at me. You know, what are you doing in this country? You're a spy. We're going to have you arrested. You're going to see the inside of a prison, and you'll never see the light of day again. I mean, he was really mean. And mind you, at the time, I'm 22 years old, so it was just like, I mean, he was really mean. And so he slams the door shut and comes back in. And this time, he sort of has a button undone on his shirt. He's got coffee and tea, and he lays all these tourist brochures out on the table. And it's like, oh, is this your first time in Iran? I'd love, to show you our country's sites. We're so excited that you're here. And sort of leaves the door slightly open. Then comes back in screaming and says, does your mother even know where you are? And blah, blah, blah. And this sort of went back and forth, these mind games. And anyway, this was several hours of this garbage. Long story short, my sort of desire to do great research on dissent in Iran, kind of unraveled. And there's sort of an ongoing theme that I won't bore you with, which is I'm not a great researcher. I'm methodologically flawed when it comes to designing, research that ends up materializing when I go places. And this was sort of the last straw. And so I decided I don't want to be an anthropologist anymore because I'm just not very good at it. And so I started doing what anyone would do, which is I wandered around the country looking for friends and people to talk to. And I remembered a trick from when I was under 21 at Stanford, and I think Jason was with me a few times. We would sort of go out, and the trick was you'd give your fake ID to a bouncer and be talking on the phone, so you looked really sort of serious and busy, and you had no problem getting in. And I tried that same trick in Iran, and that's sort of how I snuck into different universities and different places. And I met a group of young people. And the first group of young Iranians that I met, all they wanted to know was if it's dangerous to be a baby in the United States. Only question they had. And they were very sort of keen to ask me, is it dangerous to be a baby in Beverly Hills, California? Is anyone here from Beverly Hills or LA? Well, I think we all know what Beverly Hills is like, and we don't think it's dangerous to be a baby there, right? And so I was very confused by this. And it turned out that at the time, there were a series of high-profile kidnappings of high-profile babies in Beverly Hills. And the Iranian media had just like a field day with this. And so the state propaganda machine was just turning out message and broadcast after broadcast, sort of saying, if you go to the US, your baby will get stolen. It's a country of baby snatchers. And they were very sort of, they really believed this. And I thought it was crazy, but then I remembered a lot of the things that people told me before I went to Iran. Don't go there, you're going to get killed, everybody's terrorists, blah, blah, blah. And you start to realize, this is only 3 years after 9/11, and misperceptions exist both in the Middle East and in the United States, and they're highly exacerbated, right? What we know about the Middle East now versus what we knew then in terms of popular culture was quite different. And so I became really interested in this idea of figuring out where misperceptions existed on both sides. I started hanging out with all these young people. And I was in the southern city of Shiraz, and I was in a very busy marketplace. And here's where the technology piece comes in. At this very busy intersection, saw about 40 young people just sort of surrounding the shops, tapping away at their mobile devices. And I asked one of them, I said, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm recruiting a new bassist for my band. I asked another one, what are you doing? He was trying to get a date. Basically, long story short, most of these young people, like club promoters, were sort of out there just trying to sort of do random things they weren't allowed to do. And I said, well, how are you doing this? They said, oh, well, we're using Bluetooth. Now, for me, I had always viewed Bluetooth as that kind of creepy device where you walk around talking to yourself. And so I assumed that they meant something different. So I asked one of them to show me. And what I didn't realize is, the way we know Bluetooth is, as long as you're within range, it allows you to connect peer-to-peer from your handset device to your earpiece device. What Iranians were using it for is to connect from their handset device to another handset device. And they were literally calling and texting complete strangers to find out where the party was, to figure out who was doing what, and they were just doing it out in the open. So at this point, a group of young people had surrounded me. And I said to them, you're all doing things that are illegal out in public. Aren't you worried about getting caught? And they sort of laughed and said, oh, don't worry, nobody over 30 in Iran knows what Bluetooth is. And so it summed up this really fascinating generation gap that existed between the first generation that's being socialized with high prevalence of these tools. and an older generation that really was being caught quite off guard, which we've seen in various instances since then. So when I came back to the US, I talked to some of the technology stakeholders that have been at the forefront of Bluetooth technology. And I told them this story, and they understood from a technical standpoint how this was possible. But their question to me was almost universally the same, regardless of who I was talking to, which is, why would anyone want to do this? Yeah, I get that this use case is possible, but why? Isn't it kind of creepy to call and text complete strangers? Well, so herein lies what I describe as an innovation gap, which is sort of a central theme for how I think about the world, which is you can take the smartest engineers in the entire world, and if they live in free and open Western democracies, they can build an incredible product. And as smart as they are, even they cannot imagine the use cases that will develop around that product in societies that are not free and open and democratic, societies that are repressive, or societies that are socioeconomically downtrodden. And the reason for that is there's no greater driver of innovation than necessity. And there's no society that has a greater set of needs than a society that is politically repressed and socioeconomically deprived. And Iran sort of fits both of those. And so what that means is the needs and the necessities and the challenges mean that young Iranians, if you flood their country with technology, will find imaginative use cases for those tools that nobody, even its creators, could have envisioned. So you have a situation where engineers solving for the problem of how do you talk and drive at the same time ended up providing some glue that connected young Iranians who lack civil liberties to civil liberties that they might not otherwise have had. And so, an interesting way to sort of understand this is everyone here has some kind of a mobile device. How many of you, by show of hands, have ever read the instructions manual? Just by show of hands. None, probably, right? Is that a hand? Or was that 2 fingers? What? Half. He's read 2 pages of it. Why would you read the instructions manual? You're going to get a new mobile device in a year. You have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and you live in a world where you can enjoy the free flow of information. So for you, it's just, as much as you think you need your device, it's really a luxury that facilitates the basic civil liberties that you have anyway. But if you're living in a repressed environment, you're going to read the instructions manual 5 or 6 times over. You will know 100% of how to use every single aspect of any device that you're given, because that's one of the few openings and one of the few channels that you actually have to change your situation. Now, the best way to understand this, I don't know how many of you have been to repressed environments, but how many of you have spent time in poor parts of the developing world, by show of hands? Right, great. So we've all seen in traveling to these places how resourceful young people are, right? They make toys out of trash. We've seen people use and reuse things that we would have thrown away a long time ago. That same sort of instinct of resourcefulness and resilience applies to technology as well. And it's important to make that connection. Now, another interesting theme is when I came back to DC and I would talk to people about what I saw in Iran, they were very skeptical. Who cares if young people are using technology to sort of organize parties where they make alcohol in bathtubs and sinks and where they drag race down the streets? And I said, who cares about the sort of frivolous nature of what they're doing? And pay attention to one thing, which is these young people, under the auspices of flirting, having a good time, and enjoying social and recreational indulgences, are actually self-training in civil society activism using new technologies, and they don't even realize it. And maybe that doesn't matter today, but one day that will matter. Now, fast forward to June of 2009, to the Green Revolution in Iran. Government shuts down the internet. Government shuts down SMS. One of the only ways that people in Iran were actually able to share information in close proximity was through Bluetooth, and they knew how to use it instantaneously. They had been using it for years. And so that famous video of Neda Sultan being killed that spread like wildfire, when that video was originally captured, it was captured within a cluster. And the reason it was able to spread to so many different people was because they all shared it via Bluetooth. And then eventually somebody got it to someone who had an internet service provider, and that video made its way onto the desks of some of the most powerful and least accessible people on the planet, people like President Obama. And it spread so fast and so quickly that the president, when asked about it in the White House press room, couldn't say, I haven't seen it, and couldn't respond to it. And at the time, the administration had a very bad policy of there'll be no meddling in Iran. And it was a bad policy because it was based on the assumption that we could still get something out of the nuclear negotiations, which the Iranians had sort of deliberately put smack in the middle of their election, so that way they could sort of keep us out of it. What happened was some person, I don't know their name, I don't know their socioeconomic status, I don't know their role in society, or even sort of who captured that video, but they were able to get a virtual meeting with the US commander-in-chief and fundamentally change US foreign policy in a matter of 4.5 hours. Take mobile phones out of the equation, take technology out of the equation, and ask yourself the question of whether or not the world would have seen that video and the President of the United States would have actually changed his policy based on it. Now, the reason I tell you this about Iran is we've all sort of watched the Arab Spring in the last year or so. And people like to talk about how the Green Revolution was a failure in Iran. Yes, it failed to achieve the local objectives of overturning presidential elections in a country where presidential elections matter very little. But the Green Revolution succeeded in another sense. And here's where I make the argument that the Arab Spring did not begin in Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia, in December of 2010. It began in June of 2009 in the only non-Arab country in the region, Iran. And the Iranian people succeeded in putting an idea out there that large numbers of people armed with nothing more than a mobile device can speak out and can organize and can mobilize in ways that will fundamentally change civil society. It doesn't mean that revolutions are any sort of easier to finish. In fact, I think they might be faster to start and easier to start, but actually harder to finish. But it does mean that it changes the nature of civil society. And just because physical individuals are constrained by their borders does not mean that their ideas have to be. Now, I spent 4 years at the State Department looking at these issues. And my portfolio was the Middle East and South Asia and counterterrorism. There was no portfolio for technology. Technology was not a relevant conversation at the State Department when I first started in 2006. But there were a few things that are worth noting. One, Secretary Rice really believed in this. And two, President Bush really believed in this. And those were the two advocates that I had in this. Now, it might surprise you, right? But if you look at a lot of the rhetoric coming out of that administration, it resonates. This whole notion of technology being inherently democratic, technology having an empowerment bias, is something that played very well into a lot of their policies. What I didn't have was a sort of State Department machinery around me that was all embracing of these things. Now, to understand how far the State Department has come, you have to go back to 2006 and understand that people did not know what YouTube was. People did not know what Facebook was. People did not know what social networking was. People thought of technology as something that they wanted to keep their kids away from. And you literally got laughed out of the room if you brought up technology. They called YouTube Bluetooth. They called Facebook MyFace. Like, they really did not know what they were talking about. And then a few things sort of happened. Towards the end of the Bush administration, you had these massive protests in Colombia against the FARC, where technology was largely used to sort of basically create a flash mob of people that you couldn't Google or connect to any money or anything. They were totally sort of more or less anonymous. And it led to all these mass defections from the FARC. And the FARC was a big priority for the Bush administration. And I'll never forget, there was a meeting that I was in October of 2008, towards the very end of the administration. And we were briefing President Bush and Vice President Cheney on sort of the 8 years of the war on terror, what worked and what didn't work. And it was right around the time, it wasn't long after these FARC demonstrations happened. And it was sort of a really interesting case study for where the world was going. And President Bush hadn't been familiar with it. So I was describing it. And I'll never forget his face, because he almost fell back in his chair. And he sort of leaned forward and he goes, "That really happened?" And I said, "Yes." He goes, "That's awesome." And that's kind of how we left things going into the Obama administration, right? So there was this sort of lingering euphoria around what technology could do in terms of empowering civil society to push back on violent extremist groups. And then you had a president who was elected in large part because of his ability to organize people through technology. And so you would think that this was kind of a perfect storm. But it was very difficult in the early days of the Obama administration because we didn't have another case study after Colombia. We had a lot of failed case studies, right? And at the time, Iran was viewed as a big failure because after the fact, the sort of documentation of dissent was used to round people up, and a lot of the proxy and circumvention technologies ended up giving more people away. And then you had WikiLeaks. I mean, you sort of had one bad case study after the next. At the time, though, there was something else interesting that was happening, which is you had Secretary Clinton basically decide, "I'm going to champion this." Now, what's interesting is in the early days of talking to her about this, one of the things that she did was she started asking a lot of questions about how she could have used technology differently in Iowa. She was trying to actually tie her own experience in running for president and her lack of use of technology early on to inform how she thought about it in this changing world, which I thought was very interesting and something very unique to someone as Secretary of State who also ran for president. And she made a decision early on that she was going to champion internet freedom. You know, this notion that the right to connect should be a fundamental human right, and she was going to elevate this. And as a sort of signature piece of this, what we started doing is recognizing there's a lot of challenges in the world that the private sector is better equipped to address than the government. And just by virtue of what they do for mission or profit, they're basically playing that role. They're playing that role anyway. And so we started doing something very controversial at the time, and I led the first one of these, which was we started identifying CEOs of technology companies, picking challenges in the world that they knew nothing about, picking interesting spots in the world that sort of allowed them to relive their childhood dreams by going to. And we started forming these technology delegations. And we did the first one to Iraq in April of 2009. And we connected, you know, we had some of the sort of most interesting CEOs from Silicon Valley basically, you know, put on flak jackets, helmets, and, you know, go into Baghdad and other parts of Iraq to figure out how technology could be used to address some of the challenges there. And what they heard was one of the biggest challenges is amidst all the violence and security challenges, Iraq has lost its cultural identity. And it has one of the most remarkable museums in the entire world. And at the time, you know, Google was sort of experimenting with this thing called Street View, which we all know now. But one of the first places they tried it out was they street viewed the entire Iraqi National Museum, which was in a very dangerous part of the red zone that nobody could go to. And so we figured, OK, if people can't experience what Iraq is actually like culturally, let's give them the virtual experience, which isn't the same thing, but close to it. And from this conversation led to a whole other set of ideas about, you know, what technology could do. You know, the very first Twitter shortcode for the entire Middle East and North Africa was set up by Jack Dorsey in Baghdad in April of 2009. So that there's all these, like, this sort of, you know, this experiment worked. It clicked that the technology industry understands the tools but doesn't understand the challenges. Government and civil society and other stakeholders understand the challenges but don't have a clue about the tools. And we need to stop trying to sort of, you know, assume each other's skill sets and just sort of do this in partnership. And so we came up with this sort of understanding or approach to foreign policy, which is, you know, statecraft can be as much about building connections as it is doing negotiations. And that became a hallmark for how we did things. So we figured, OK, where is the technology industry willing and interested in going to that they wouldn't normally get the experience of going to? And let's test this idea. So we took them to the Congo. We took them to Mexico. We took them to Russia. You know, we took them to Syria. We took them sort of all over the place. And a couple other sort of interesting realizations popped up from this. We were in Russia in President Medvedev's office. And the CEO of eBay you know, was having a conversation with the Russian side of the delegation. And, you know, at that moment, we realized, you know, look, we'd been hammering the Russians over and over again on, you know, how they need to address corruption, they need to, you know, have more accountability and transparency if they want more foreign direct investment for American companies. And they literally thought we were making it up. They did not believe us. And so what's interesting about the private sector is they're not that diplomatic. Right? So the CEO of eBay says to, you know, the Russians, I won't do business in your country. And the reason I won't do business in your country is because you're corrupt, because you don't do A, B, and C. And it was literally like a diplomatic démarche of my dreams. Right? And it's something that government officials could never say. But by basically facilitating contact between the American private sector and our Russian counterparts, a very meaningful and productive, believable conversation happened. And as a result, without us even knowing, they secretly contacted our private sector partners, went with them to the airport, talked about how they could change, and so forth. And so this became a whole new approach to diplomacy. It was sort of like diplomatic triangulation around issues that we really cared about. So we tried the same thing in Syria. Now, in retrospect, what's happening in Syria makes this trip very interesting. My last diplomatic trip that I took at the State Department was to Syria in June of 2010. And we brought 5 CTOs and CEOs from major technology companies that, within the sanctions exemptions, were able to do business in Syria. And the reason we did it is we were trying to get Bashar al-Assad's regime to change certain aspects of their behavior. And what we wanted to do was dangle the carrot of us facilitating more American technology investment in Syria in front of them in exchange for them actually changing some of their behaviors. And we made it very clear that we can make this all go away with the snap of our fingers. Sanctions are complicated. There's not a lot of business opportunities in Syria. Nobody's sort of naturally interested in doing business there. But we wanted to show them that we can make this happen if you change certain things. Now, ultimately, it all went south, but it was an interesting experiment. And the fact that, so in 4 years, if I look at sort of my own time in government, we went from not understanding technology at all at the State Department to a situation where we're relying in some respects on major technology stakeholders to help advance certain objectives in countries as difficult as Syria that we have sanctions on. It was an extraordinary leap. And not a leap that you can give any one person credit for, just a sort of more reflective of the changing times. Now we sort of begin to sort of transfer from State Department to Google. And the reason I describe all this for you is people ask me, how is life different at Google? It must be so much better. And I always say, I'm sort of doing the same thing that I did before. I meet with the same people. I work on the same countries. I work on the same set of issues. I just sort of sit near bouncy balls and don't pay for lunch anymore, and have more resources and engineers and a different set of capabilities and a different toolkit. And had I not worked at the State Department for 4 years, I wouldn't be able to make good use of the Google experience to address some of the issues that I care about. And so it's all sort of part of the same narrative of addressing violence in the world and looking at the intersection of technology and international relations. Now, what was interesting about the experience at Google is I was basically hired to run this thing called Google Ideas, but we hadn't defined what Google Ideas was. So imagine how tough a challenge that is. You come into a company with brilliant people who have lots of ideas, who understand technology inside out, and here I am as a non-engineer coming in with the tough task of building out this entity. You can't do that on your own. And so I basically said, OK, I'm going to shape this thing with as many people at this company as possible. And so we started bringing people in. We started building out the team. And we took a very sort of initially humble approach, which is we don't know what this is going to be yet. What we know is technology is going to be relevant to every challenge in the world. And we know that solutions to these challenges that utilize technology are massively underexplored. And that's basically the premise of what this is. We're going to figure out how, as a company, we should sort of enter into that space. And what I told everybody early on is we are going to define ourselves and shape ourselves by what we do, as opposed to building out a strategy and all these things and then trying to match it with projects. And I'm so glad we did that, because it would have been a disaster. And it's very sort of counterintuitive to how you would think about building a business. But remember, I was building a business within a company that had lots of resources and so forth. I wasn't building it in a garage. And so sometimes when you're trying to sort of build something unorthodox, you have to throw all the traditional models out the window. You have to sort of adapt to what you see, and you have to sort of understand the surroundings in which you're building something. So I spent a lot of time early on at Google figuring out, OK, the first project that we do, it has to be big, it has to be different, it has to be distinctly not philanthropic, it has to be wildly outside of our core business, it has to make people at Google wonder what this is and why we're doing this, and it has to be controversial and make people nervous. And if we're not doing all those things, then there was no point in creating this thing to begin with. And what I wanted to show early on is Google, as a massive company with a huge global brand, can convene around a set of issues in constructive ways that I don't think anybody else can. And there was a challenge that I was particularly interested in, which was countering violent extremism. And to give you a little bit of personal background on this, also when I was in grad school, I took a lot of trips to the Middle East beyond just Iran. I interviewed a lot of Hezbollah fighters in southern Lebanon. I interviewed a number of al-Qaeda fighters on the Syria-Iraq border. I interviewed some Al-Shabab al-Ansar fighters and a variety of others. And when I would interview these militants and ask them why they joined, typically they would start with some sort of religious or ideological explanation. And then my favorite next question to ask them is, what date and year were you born? And they'd tell me and look very confused. How old were you when you started school? What's your earliest memory? I would basically retrace their whole socialization path up until the point where something happened. They got bad grades and got kicked out of school. Their girlfriend dumped them. A family member died. Something happened. Well, who did you go to for support? Well, I couldn't go home because I couldn't tell my parents I got kicked out of school. Or I played football with these kids and they started bringing me to this mosque. Or I got into a fight with my parents, and instead of going to the mosque that was a 20-minute walk, I always wondered why we never went to the mosque that was a 5-minute walk. And so you realize how much chance plays into this. You realize how much most people who grow up to be violent extremists, it starts with some basic grievance that many people in this room have experienced in some way, shape, or form. And then the rest is left to where the support network comes from. And there's a randomness aspect of it. So you start talking to these people, and it's very easy to sort of view them as mass militants shouting Allahu Akbar and so forth. But you realize that they're much more sort of much better described as broken souls with dangerous toys. By the time they have dangerous toys, they've sort of reached a point of no return where counter-radicalizing them is almost impossible. And I became very sort of fixated on the human aspect of this. And I had this theory that behind every terrorist is also a young person. If we could figure out who that young person was and where they came from, maybe we could get some interesting insights into why people join these groups. So I sort of took this away from me, and then when I joined Secretary Rice's team, I worked a lot on Colombia at the time. And I remember a couple months after the hostage rescue of the FARC, I went down to Colombia, and I talked to about a dozen demobilized FARC and ELN and AUC terrorists. And I remember hearing why they joined these groups. Some of them had been in for like 10, 15 years. And had I not been in Colombia, seen what they looked like, heard their accents, and sort of had the context around me, I could have sworn I was back in the Middle East hearing the same exact people. I started thinking, these people, they're Marxist. So by virtue of that, they don't even have a religion. How can their stories be so similar when on the surface things look so different? So remember, I came back and I asked Secretary Rice if she would send me to Central America to interview gang members to see if some of the same trends existed. And so she thought it was weird, but let me go to Central America, and I interviewed MS-13, 18th Street, a variety of other gangs. And same things, right? Not identical stories, but very, very similar. Very similar narrative paths. And when I was in government, I really wanted to convene former members of these groups in one place. And I was repeatedly told that that would be a very bad Washington Post headline, right? Like U.S. government's big hug for ex-terrorists, right? And so I was told, interesting idea, but we just can't do this. It's just not going to happen. And I kept trying all the way to the end, but just not going to happen. And so I remember when I was sort of talking to Google about the job, every one of my conversations, in some respects, centered around this idea. Is this the kind of thing that I could do at Google? Could I bring a bunch of former violent extremists together? And they said, yeah, sounds great. Do it. Why not? And so I remember my first day on the job. I'm walking into the office for the first time. I'm like on the phone with a former Latin king, but like I've got a 2 o'clock appointment with a former blood, and like talking to this former Islamist at like 6 o'clock. And this is just sort of, we just sort of started doing this. And I'm convinced that we started doing it so fast and got so much momentum that it got to a point where people just got on board because of the inevitability of it. And it seemed like the perfect thing to do, if not very scary, as a first project. And before I sort of describe this, I want to show a video that kind of is a teaser for what it actually was. If you could put that up.
For 20 years, I was a Muslim extremist.
My aunts, my uncles, my father, my cousins, everybody was a gang member.
They would hold me back and force me to watch as they stabbed my white English friends before my eyes.
Very early on, just not liking that sense of powerlessness.
I've stabbed 3 kids in my life, and I'm not proud of that.
When 9/11 happened, I actually celebrated the attacks.
The racist attacks led me to suffer an acute identity crisis.
I had to learn to fight back, or else I'd get abused even more.
My first encounter with a gang was when I was in 5th grade. I was 11 years old.
I went to the streets for camaraderie, comfort. That's where the gang members embraced me and welcomed me with open arms.
Gangs, cults, extremist groups provide a strong sense of solidarity and brotherhood.
A lot of it was not being alone anymore.
All of my friends were involved. It was more like a family structure.
I had no clue what the difference was between true respect and fear. You can never look weak. Weakness gets you killed.
A lot of fights, a lot of beatings.
We were taught to hate people who weren't Muslim and to regard ourselves as superior, that we are part of something important and noble, despite the evidence we see to the contrary.
We would have training sessions every week, solid, for 2 hours that were compulsory to attend.
If a young person is considering joining a gang, prepare to die.
I could name off the top of my head 50 people that I knew and cared about who were now dead, and I didn't want to be added to that list.
I tried to keep this kid who was from the neighborhood out. He was 14 years old and he was murdered. He's probably the main reason why I do the work that I do now for the past 10 years, helping young kids like that.
What we had originally started was actually destroying us from the inside.
My main goal is to just to take the term former and make it cool.
The best solution is to make extremist ideas taboo through public awareness campaigns. Initiatives such as this at Google are wonderful for that.
So we're all learning how we can all work together in this big cohesive group.
I think that's what we human beings are all about, really, is our deep humanity, and I think this summit will manifest some incredibly profound human connections.
So it's important to note when we did this, so we're only a little over a year old, as I mentioned. So this was June of last year. We didn't even have a structure yet. We didn't have a strategy. We didn't have a business strategy. I had borrowed people. I hadn't formulated my team yet. We got a logo like 2 weeks before and business cards a couple weeks before. So all we had was this idea, and we were putting sort of all the chips on the table because we're basically, in some respects, the first idea that we were testing at Google Ideas was whether or not the company could do things like this and add value around a hugely, hugely important, difficult challenge. And so we focused all our energy, in the early months of Google Ideas, just trying to get something like this off the ground. And so we ended up bringing 84 former gang members, former violent Islamists, former violent nationalists, and former violent white supremacists from over 40 different countries around the world to Dublin and put them in one place. Nobody had ever sort of, as a company, our mission is organize the world's information, make it universally available, and make it useful. I think we took quite a literal sort of interpretation of that mission statement, but I figured, you know what? If our success in organizing data allows us to organize humans in this kind of a way and has it actually be constructive, what an incredible demonstration of what we as a company can convene around. What a sort of powerful demonstration of how we don't need to shy around these scary, controversial topics that are sort of underexplored, where technology is not being looked at, and that keep people up at night. And so to give you sort of an idea of just kind of who was there, so imagine from the gang side, former Bloods, Crips, Latin Kings, former Nigerian gang members. From the Islamist side, former Ansari Hezbollah from Iran, former Jamaat Islamiyah from Indonesia, former Boko Haram from Nigeria. I mean, you had former violent Islamists from like almost every continent you could imagine. We had people who had trained to become suicide bombers. We had people who had incited violence all across the world in previous incarnations. From the violent white supremacist side, we had former neo-Nazis, former skinheads, former hammer-skin nations. From the violent nationalist side, we had former Tamil Tigers, first time ever the government let them out of the country, former IRA, former Ulster Defense Force, all in one room. And then we had a former violent Israeli settler as well. And one of the sort of most powerful examples of this is we had two former Nigerians. One was a former violent Christian extremist. One was a former violent Muslim extremist. The Muslim imam had cut off the violent Christian's arm in the name of Islam 5 years earlier with a machete. And now they work on interfaith issues together in the most dangerous parts of Nigeria. Now, one important piece to notice, they're all former, right? So our definition of former is they left the organizations they used to be part of, and now they're actively and publicly working against the organizations they used to be part of. So, the risks that I had to hedge against are asylum seeking, making sure they really were former, making sure that they really had become positive activists. And so a very rigorous process went into this. But, everyone in the lead up to this, including me, was terrified of what would happen, right? I mean, it's sort of, if you think about and imagine all the risks, it's like quite incredible that the company let us do this. And I remember the 5 days before, I didn't sleep at all because I was thinking, I had invited a lot of people that I knew from different walks of life to come, and I figured I either invited them to watch something extraordinary unfold, or I invited them to watch my career implode and like be there for me afterwards. But what was so amazing about this is, as soon as you put them all in the room together, it worked. They started to realize how similar their stories were. They started to, begin plans for how they could work together. And almost every single former that we invited express skepticism to me ahead of time. What do I have in common with these people? What do I have in common with those people? And it's very important to understand that you cannot invite a bunch of former violent extremists just like that and expect them to come. It was like organizing a peace summit, right? So you'd be on the phone with the former white supremacists who are going to walk out if the former gang members don't do this. And it was like literally, so much handling of personalities and socializing people and incentivizing and helping people sort of get to a point where they would just get on a plane. And then we also had 20 survivors of terrorism as well. So we had a panel with a young girl who had been kidnapped by al-Shabaab for 15 months. She moderated a panel with a former al-Shabaab who had been an active violent extremist in the part of Somalia that she was kidnapped in. And just the power of their ability to interact. And it just sort of, it really flipped things upside down. What was interesting was the reaction from current violent extremist groups around the world. The violent Islamists hated it because they didn't like being compared to, quote, street thugs. Gangs around the world didn't like it because they didn't like being compared to, quote, religious loonies. The violent nationalists around the world didn't like it because they didn't like being compared to people they thought had no ideology. And violent white supremacists around the world didn't like being compared to blacks, Muslims, anybody that wasn't white. And so it's by sort of stripping all of these organizations of what they think is spectacular about them and breaking it down and really simplifying and reducing violent extremism to what it is, which is the exploitation of young people. Google was able to, by convening, put out a whole new narrative for how people think about violent extremism. And to me, sort of one metric of success was when, in her speech at the UN General Assembly, where all the heads of state every year come together, the president of Kyrgyzstan, who was the first president post-coup, post-democracy in Kyrgyzstan, got up and a central piece of her speech was about what Google and CFR had done together, bringing these formers together, a new chapter in how the private sector is going to engage in some of these issues. And for us, as a sort of young think/do tank, that was really rewarding. So then after the summit, we sort of finally sat down and was like, okay, what should Google ideas be? And we realized, why have a sort of concrete organizational structure that we adhere to, and why not just continue to adapt what Google Ideas is every time we do something? If our central point is to focus on challenges that aren't necessarily philanthropic, aren't necessarily core business, why do we need anything more than that? Let's just go out and do stuff. Let's change how people think about and act on these challenges. Let's make sure technology is more part of the solution, part of our understanding, and so forth. So to give you an idea of what we're doing next, and then I'll open it up to questions, is we've decided that this year our focus is going to be on illicit networks. So as I alluded to earlier, drug cartels, human trafficking, organ trafficking, arms smuggling, organized crime. All of these networks are deeply, deeply siloed, right? So human trafficking is a human rights issue. Narco trafficking is a law enforcement issue. Organized crime is a Justice Department issue. And so, different silos are using different sets of tools. But when you reframe the challenge of illicit networks and look at it through the lens of technology, we as a technology company see one thing. We see a set of organizations that maybe look different on the surface, but when we think about technology, they seem to all have one thing in common, which is they require secrecy and discretion in order to be able to function. So we think we're pretty good as a technology company at surfacing and organizing information. And so our mission is, okay, if this is what these illicit networks need to thrive, let's see if we can actually counter and disrupt these illicit networks by mapping out their activities. Let's see if we can use transparency and data as a way to visually represent represent the sort of activities against the will of some of these organizations, right? So think about a day in the life of an illicit dollar. All of these organizations move illicit money. Well, wouldn't it be useful if we could see where it was all going? Now, like every project at Google Ideas, I don't know what we'll be able to do. I don't know if in the end it will look like what we started. What I do know is as a company, we're willing to stand up and say this is a huge challenge. There's not any one clear stakeholder leading the charge. We're not saying that we have all the answers. What we are saying is we're ready to stand up and make a play at this and sort of focus on what we're good at, which is figuring out how technology can be part of the solution. And so that's kind of an example of what you'll see from us this year. So hopefully I've given you a lot of random things to think about. Questions? Yep.
Thank you very much for coming here. And I find your ideas very innovative. But I find that violence tends to be more often than not just violent extremists, but military on civilians. So how do you think your framework will tackle that?
There's a lot of challenges out there. We're not going to work on all of them. You know, the way that we pick what we focus on is it's a number of things. One, I mean, there's an element of sort of the things that I'm passionate about and am interested in, but I also now have a team, and we sort of as a group come up with these things. But you know, one of the things that I have to balance, we're also a public company, right? So I can't go out and do whatever I want, right? There's certain, and when we were thinking about this issue of sort of state-sanctioned violence, certainly came up. And one of the decisions we made is, you know, the appropriate space for us to be working is violence perpetrated by non-state actors against civilians. That was a decision that we made. You can agree or disagree with it, but that was the decision we made. Yep.
Both in 2009 during the protests in Iran and then again in Syria, there's been a lot of debate about denial of service attacks, whether, you know, some people think that it can limit the government's ability to monitor people, then it also limits people's ability to organize on social networks. What are your views on denial of service attacks?
Yeah, so does everybody know what denial of service attacks are? Yeah, okay. So there's certainly a problem. It's going to be a cat and mouse game between citizens and states, right? So if citizens are going to, as citizens get new technologies in places like Syria, they're going to come up with innovative ways to use it to catch the regime by surprise, and then the regime's going to get smart and get technology from, you know, similarly like-minded states, and they're going to be able to crack down, as we've seen with a lot of these denial of service attacks. I don't think that that's what the primary problem is in Syria. I think it's a piece of the problem. You know, if you look at Syria right now, there's almost no content that's coming out of the country that's gone viral. Over 10,000 people have been killed. That's more than half the people that Hafez al-Assad killed in 1982. And this is certainly the worst violence that we've seen since the Arab Spring started, and it's the worst violence we've seen in the region perpetrated by a regime against its people, you know, probably since Saddam Hussein massacred the Shia in the early 90s. So it's very, very significant what's happening there, and it's very strange that nobody's paying attention to it. And you might think it's because, oh, there's no horrific videos. We're not seeing what's actually coming out of there. Well, I talk to a lot of dissidents every day who share content with me that's horrific. I mean, like some of the worst videos you could possibly imagine, and they have 12 views, 15 views. And so I think the problem is that, you know, the people on the ground who have access to the content that can make the world pay attention, you know, they're sort of, civil society in some respects needs marketing training, right? You know, having the content isn't good enough anymore. You know, having the ability to take that content and present it to the world in a meaningful way is important. And then I think the other piece of this is I think governments haven't yet thought about what virtual interventions look like, right? So, you know, if you look at, you know, the history of humanitarian crises or human rights crises, like look at Rwanda. You know, the failure of Rwanda was not the U.S. government's unwillingness to send troops into harm's way. The failure of the U.S. government in Rwanda was the U.S. government's unwillingness to make intervention and commitment of full-scale troops anything but synonymous, right? So we neglected as a government to think about everything in between doing nothing and doing everything. And I think when we look at Syria, there's an opportunity to reevaluate, you know, how technology creates more opportunities and options for governments to intervene to help people. And we haven't really sort of understood what that actually looks like. I mean, frankly speaking, it's a great project for anybody in school to look at, which is how does technology change the nature of intervention? You know, and then there's the other piece of this, which is, you know, for the first time ever, an individual sitting in New York or sitting in San Francisco can actually, you know, sort of stage their own intervention of sorts. And we've certainly seen that in plenty of instances. Like you actually, with your computer, in the future are going to be able to play much more of a role in helping people on the ground in these places than at any other time in history. Yes?
Regarding the...
Before we go on, can we just speak into the microphone so we can capture it?
Thanks so much for being here. Regarding the criteria for your formers that were in the conference in Dublin, were you picking people that had just rejected their former radical organizations, or had they also rejected the ideology? Because you could be a former Islamicist but still believe that, you know, America's presence in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan and Iraq are fundamentally evil.
Yeah, we had, I mean, it's to be credible in a lot of senses, you need people who share those views. And here's the way that I've always thought about former is politics aside. Do they reject violence? Will they speak out against violence? Will they sort of reject the organizations that used to target civilians that they used to be part of? And to me, one of the most amazing things about pulling this group together in Dublin, I had a lot of conversations with these people. They were very opinionated when it came to politics. Very, very opinionated. And my big fear was that this was going to turn into a big conversation about U.S. foreign policy in Israel. And it's remarkable it didn't come up once. And I thought we were going to have to, like, heavy-handed keep that stuff off the table. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And the group almost policed itself, saying we're not here to talk about politics. We're here to understand how our shared experience can shed light on what we can do as formers. Because what you have to understand is, part of the motivation for doing this is since 9/11, everybody's been asking where are the voices against violent extremism. And my logic is there seems to be plenty out there. Nobody's bothered to organize any of them and put them together. And what's very interesting is I got contacted a few days ago by several formers who I hadn't even heard of, who had seen the sort of network come together in Dublin and wanted to know how to get part of it, how to become part of it. They said we had no idea there were other formers out there. And that, to me, is sort of a testament to why this is important and why this group understood this. Right? This is a group that loves talking about politics. But if you think about what they wanted to get out of it, what they wanted was to be part of a larger network that could amplify their voices. A former on their own is very easy to discredit, very easy to shame. But formers as a collective is a much more powerful force. And it was just this. I wonder if we tried to do it again, would it work? I do. Maybe we got lucky. I don't know. But politics did not come up. It was truly remarkable. Yep.
Coming off of your experience building this new entity within Google with a very particular and open mandate, I wonder if you could, if you've thought about or even could just think out loud with us now about doing something similar within business schools. So, we have a very willing administration here and a willing student body to think about how to use our 2 years here and how to use this institution to do, to take on similar challenges. And I wonder how you think about the role of the university, but specifically business schools in this context.
I think it's a great question. I think the short answer is, yeah, you should do something like this. People often ask me,
so what's the organizational form? You thought up something sort of new and identified a gap.
So think about what, so all of you, some of you will go into finance, some of you will go into management consulting, some of you will go into technology, some of you will go into the nonprofit work. And one of the remarkable things about an excellent business school like this is you admit people who have a lot of work experience already, because it adds to the color of, the classroom dynamics. And it's part of, what, the promise is to give you a business school, which is not just the academic coursework, but the benefit of each other's experiences. And so as a starting point, figure out who's interested in something like this, figure out what skill sets you have, what perspectives you have, what networks you have access to, and then figure out where the best place is to take that collective toolkit and channel it. You may pick a totally different set of challenges, but my view on things is if you have an instinct to go start something, just go do it. When you're looking for your next job, assume that the job you want doesn't exist and go create it for yourself. It's a very simple formula, I think, for finding a job, which is, pick your next job by who your boss is, assume that job doesn't exist, and then find that next boss and create that job with them based on sort of what you think is the biggest gap. So what you've done is you've identified a gap that you, at least personally view exists within the business school community. Figure out sort of some friends to get together with and do it, and shape it based on your own vision and your own interests. If you do it based on things that you guys aren't interested in, it will fail. And if you do it based on things that are obvious and that other people in business schools are trying to do, it will be uninteresting. So if you want to do something interesting that's designed to succeed, make sure it fits your passions and make sure that it hasn't been done before. That would be my advice. Yeah. I've got to mix it up a little bit. So.
You spoke about the commonalities in the life experiences of people before they became the terrorists and the extremists. What were the commonalities in the life stories of how they became formers?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. What you realize in talking to these people is, you find very few people involved in violent extremism in any of those four contexts over the age of like 35. And so it's funny, even those of us that have looked at this issue for a long time, we very infrequently ask the question, what happens to all those people? And they get married, they sort of grow out of it, they get bored of it. Most people, almost everybody that joins violent extremism leaves at some point. They may die, they may end up in prison, but they leave. And so the question we had is like, what happens to them? It's most people leave and they don't reject it. They just sort of, it's like a phase of their life. In doing this, we realized there's different stages of being former. Right? So we had I mentioned this Al-Shabaab guy that was there, who was literally, he had only left Al-Shabaab in 2009. And he went from being a senior level member of Al-Shabaab in Somalia to a high school security guard at a parking lot in Canada. And he had an NGO that he was trying to start that he couldn't get money for. Like, nobody would pay attention to him. He sort of rambles a lot. And what you realize for someone like that is he kept saying, if nobody's going to help me, I'm just going to go back. And you realize, you realize that no, it's not that he still has sympathies. It's that the drop in status from being a current to being a former is the first sort of shock wave that these people experience. They go from being somebody to being right. So they start their lives as nobody, then they join and become somebody, and then they go back to being nobody. And they think they're making the right decision, and they're wondering why nobody's rewarding them for it. And to me, this is the most dangerous stage of somebody being a former, right? Because what we realize in this is there's nobody capturing people at that stage and providing them with counter-radicalization training. There's no sort of community of formers to welcome somebody like that in. And then you also imagine the sort of psychological trauma that comes with this. And then you have people who are like professional formers. They're on the lecture circuit, they've got books, they've got like paid speeches, and there's sort of multiple stages in between. And there's no better way to sort of massage this process than having formers do it themselves. So our commitment as a company was, look, we're not going to organize the formers going forward. We're going to create the technological space for them. They need certain things. There's a lot of people out there who want to offer certain things, right? Lawyers wanting to offer pro bono services, management consultants wanting to offer help with sort of NGO business strategies. We will create a central space and the technological plumbing to make that easier. We will help map out the space or universe of counter-radicalization activity. But it's, for most of them, they'll describe leaving as a process, not a moment. It's not like something happened and then they leave automatically. It's hard, first of all, it's hard to leave these groups. Second of all, you sort of often, it's like a relationship, right? You break up and then get back together, break up and then get back together, and it's sort of, it's an interesting piece of the puzzle that you don't typically think about. And every single one of them says what kept them out was having some sort of group to be part of, whether it was an NGO or an academic institution or their family taking them back or something of that nature. Yep.
Thanks. So the two first projects you've been discussing at Google Ideas, they're very controversial, I agree, and they focus on, I guess, bringing light to some very illicit activities, some very dangerous activities. I'd just like to hear what measures do you and does Google take as a corporation to protect your security?
We have a corporate security team, and these are it's an interesting question, right? Because there's a whole set of security issues that come up around Google Ideas projects that are kind of new. But I think it's a testament to what kind of company Google is, that they're not only willing to try projects like this, but that we actually are able to adapt to be able to keep our employees safe, which is our top priority, and keep people that we're working with safe. And all I can say in answer to your question is we have an excellent security team, and we have the ability to actually adapt to make things like this possible.
And they love Jared.
I give them tough challenges.
In terms of using this as kind of along the same lines as creating a group like in business school, what is the conversation within Google around this as a model for other companies to do something similar in their own space? I read an article in Fast Company talking about what Apple should have done with its $100 billion instead of a stock buyback and a dividend, and it talked about some of the challenges that they had previously discussed, revolutionizing education or whatever it is. What do you think about demonstrating that model, and is there any kind of internal conversation about that?
Yeah, no, this is an excellent question. And one of the ways that I define success for Google Ideas is do other companies end up sort of building their own version of this. Now, it's, I want to be very clear, like the stuff that we do, it's not exclusive to Google products. Like we're doing this because we're doing it on behalf of technology. Right? We are a major player in the technology sector. We're putting a lot of these public tools out on the out around the globe. We know that technology, has an empowerment bias, but it empowers people both for good and for ill. And so we have a responsibility as a company. We have the ethos as a company to want to do this. And the stuff that we're working on, it's hardly proprietary, right? And so my view or my vision is, can we get the whole industry thinking about these issues, right? That is absolutely one way that I will measure success. I don't care sort of what it's called. I don't care where it sits in their org chart. What I know, it's a collective responsibility as an industry. And I am actually quite convinced, having watched the industry from outside and knowing what I know about sort of the nature of global challenges and where they're going, I actually think it's inevitable. Because I think in the future, companies will have two choices, right? So again, if all these new people are coming online and we assume that technology is going to be intertwined with every challenge in the future, whether it's obvious or not, then companies have two choices. One is they can wait until their tools are used or become relevant to these challenges in some way that's good or bad and react to it with communications or crisis communications or whatever it is. Or they can sort of recognize the inevitability of that and proactively make the decision that, you know what, if this is the direction the technology is going in, and we know that these are going to be challenges that intertwine with these tools, let's responsibly take the time to think about how we use our convening power, how we use our engineering power, how we use our financial resources. And let's figure out where we as a company can make a positive contribution. Because if we don't do it proactively, we're going to have to do it reactively. I believe that in the future, it's going to be very hard for any company to stay neutral on any issue, at least from the technology sector, just given the nature of these tools and how they intersect with everything. Over here and then in the back. Or in the back, whichever is more convenient. Why don't you go first, and then we'll...
I'm curious about how you deal with some of the most intractable problems. Do you see a threshold where certain conditions have to exist for you to be able to make a large enough impact, or do you simply say, this isn't a problem that's important enough to look at, let's see what we come up with?
I'm interested in challenges that we're not thinking about yet. So that's how I measure. If we're already sort of spending a lot of time in this space, then there's not really a need for Google Ideas, right? Google Ideas is designed to fill certain gaps that we know eventually are going to become relevant. So I'll give you an example. Like I don't know if we'll end up doing this or not, but I was just in Libya about a month ago, or 2 months ago. When was I there? January. Okay, so a few months ago. And one of the observations that I made in a meeting with the president was that there didn't seem to be any security on the street. And there was no looting. I was like really baffled by this, right? So I asked him, I said, where's the army? Oh, we haven't formed them yet. Oh, where's the police? They haven't started yet. So there's no police, there's no army, there's no security. Like you could go rob somebody and there's nobody to report the crime to. There was no sort of independent judiciary yet. There was no prosecutors yet. I mean, there was like nothing. And it was sort of this, it was just miraculous that there was no looting. I think it's sort of maybe a calm before the storm, but that's sort of more of a geopolitical question. But I started asking, the sort of the new Libyan government, most of who had been back for about 3 weeks for the first time in like 25 plus years. Mind you, Gaddafi had been in power since the late 60s. It's actually longer than 25 plus years. And they said the biggest problem we have is there's 80 militias all wearing civilian clothes with a ratio of 3 guns to every people. Like we need to get the guns off the street, and we don't know where the guns are. So we don't know how to do this. And so I said, well, I've sort of worked a lot on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, and it's usually a pretty simple process of, people line up, hand you their AK-47s, and you give them $300 and kind of hope for the best. Now the problem is, in the past, corrupt government officials take those arms and then sell them back for half the price, so people sort of turn to price. So anyway, so I sort of threw out this idea, I wonder what would happen if you did a handsets for arms program. Right? So again, I'm not saying Google doing this. It was just sort of an idea. But imagine a situation where you give people smartphones in exchange for their arms. And by accepting the exchange, they have to opt into a certain kind of geolocation. They have to go through a reintegration program, and so you know where they are. The phone is loaded with all these sort of training apps and so forth, and they're on a 3-strike policy. If they're not where they're supposed to be or not showing up for their training class, first time they get a text message warning. Second time, their data plan gets suspended for 24 hours. And the third time, their data plan gets suspended indefinitely, and their phone gets confiscated. And after 12 months, if they sort of complete the reintegration program, they get to keep the phone. And I think it was the interior, whatever the equivalent of sort of the soon-to-be interior minister was like, that's an interesting idea. Mind you, the country had literally just sort of gotten technology. It's like literally one of the most virgin markets you can possibly, like North Korea-esque in terms of how virgin it is. But it just sort of, I'm always trying to look for these opportunities where you can try something a little bit different. Now, my guess is that's going to be a hard one to sort of, get off the ground, but nonetheless, it's a provocative conversation to have. I don't know if that answered. I don't even remember what your question was, but okay.
This is just going back to your comment about marketing of issues. I think as frequent technology users, we're all activists in a certain sense. Like we can sign a petition and then never think about it again. So how does Google Ideas and the platform of technology, how are you going to generate an audience around the issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, part of it is, if we're not doing something that sparks curiosity and discussion, it's probably not interesting enough, right? So there was something that someone said to me my first day at the State Department, where he said, look, if you want to have an impact in this place, you need to piss a lot of people off. And so what he meant by that is if you're not creating waves, you're not doing anything interesting. If you're creating too many waves, you're unnecessarily pissing people off. And so you try to find the right balance. But I think there has to be a sort of provocative aspect to this, right? Our goal at Google Ideas isn't we're not trying to be the ones to solve these problems. Right? We're very modest in terms of what we think our role is. We are trying to provoke the right sets of people into thinking about and acting on these challenges in different ways. So success for us is, do we change some of the approaches by some of the things that we pilot? Do we get technology into the mix in ways that people weren't thinking about it before? So success is whether or not something that we sort of pilot or do in a small way ends up organically taking on its own form, and people don't even remember whether or not Google was involved in this. This is not sort of this is not about sort of how do we make Google look good. This is about sort of an urgency to make sure that people who understand the tools and people who understand the issues are working together to figure out how technology can be used to address some of these challenges. There's someone behind you. Yeah.
I was just curious as to whether you've had conversations with Google shareholders as to whether they support it, whether they are just happy that Google's making money anyway and so they're fine with Google Ideas going on. Certainly Google has more leeway than other companies, but I'm just wondering if you've had any of those kind of conversations.
Well, one, I'm a Google shareholder, and I talk to myself a lot. And maybe some of you are, so now I've talked to you. No, look, it's a very, I talk to Google, lots of people, who would sort of be described as Google shareholders. And one of the sort of important things to navigate is we are a public company. We have a responsibility to shareholders. So what can we do to change the world in a positive way without violating that relationship or without harming that relationship with shareholders? Now, one of the things I consistently hear from people is, they like seeing Google being used to affect positive change, right? So there's when you look at a lot of these challenges, right, it's unless somebody can put their hand up and say, that person knows the answer, let them do it, there's a lot of space for not just Google, but the technology industry as a whole to start thinking about some of these challenges. Believe me, there's plenty of sort of checks and balances on the sort of relationship between, Google as a corporation and its shareholders. And Google Ideas certainly fits within that. But people have been excited about Google getting into these spaces, in part because most people who are shareholders understand or have enough familiarity with technology to understand where it's going. And understand sort of who's coming online and where they're coming online and why we have to do this. Great. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you, Jared. So just to wrap up, I think the purpose of this series really is to complement Dean Henry and Vice Dean Brandenberger's vision for the school, which is for students to start thinking about more, not what is, but what can be. And I think, Jared, your conversation today couldn't have been a better launch to this series. So
happy to help.
Thank you very much. And this is just a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
So, and hopefully we'll have him back with Eric after the book comes out.
Yes.
We'll hold you to that.
It's due in 2 weeks. So.
All right.
I don't know how it's going to get done, but.